Hi guys, hope you've all had a nice evening. So today's lesson is on unstructured interviews. So exactly the same as structured interviews in the sense that you're doing them face to face, you're asking participant questions, but in this case there's no script and it's open rather than closed questions. So if I could get you to write your own definition of an unstructured interview, please. Okay, so in terms of looking at an unstructured interview, I've given you a specific example here. So what this has come from is there is a social researcher who got funded by 3 different charities in America to interview, he's called it the white underbelly of America, and it's people that wouldn't normally get their voice shared, and it tends to be like criminals, drug addicts, prostitutes, homeless people who wouldn't normally get their voice shown. So I've selected a particular example for you. I picked this example because it's probably the least shocking and upsetting out of all of them. But if you look down the list on the right hand side and you see one that interests you more, I am completely fine with that. Pick whichever one of these you want because they're all conducted and following sociological guidelines by a charity. Now, you only need to watch the first 5 minutes. If you want to watch the rest, that's absolutely fine, but just watch the first 5 minutes to kind of get the hang of how unstructured interviews are set up. Okay, so hopefully now you've watched that. So we're going to go through our normal evaluation, starting with practical. So they are quite complex research methods to conduct because they take a long amount of time to do, but we'll get to that in a minute. We're going to start with the particular advantages of using an unstructured interview. Now, firstly, they can be a bit easier for the participant than with a structured interview because it's not scripted. The participant can ask more questions when they don't understand, or the researcher can change their language to make people feel more comfortable. Now, in the example I've given you children, which is a really good example to look at, where you might need to alter your language a little bit to get people feeling comfortable to speak up. So that's your first advantage, and if I could get you to answer that question in bold. Secondly, we've used this term a lot, which is whether the research is flexible or not. Now, what you can do with an unstructured interview that you can't do with a structured interview is if you start to hear something that's interesting or you didn't know about, you can ask more questions about it, which we know is a big advantage. What this also offers the researcher is, say if they are studying something they might not know a lot about, so in this case we can tell it's very unlikely that the researcher may have known a lot about body modification before interviewing this person. They don't have to have much prior knowledge because you are entrusting the participant to lead the interview rather than you having to come up with relevant questions. So that's one big advantage of one big practical advantage. And again, if I could get you to answer that question in bold there. Okay, moving on then. So you can see in comparison there's a lot more disadvantages than advantages. So they are time consuming because they're not scripted and the participant can talk as long as they want. And even if you look down in the right bar at the different interviews, some of them go on for longer than an hour. So if I could get you to look at the 2 reasons I've said they're time consuming and develop that, explain why those things would take a long amount of time. Now, if you remember, the type of data that comes from this is qualitative. It's qualitative data, but more than that, a lot of the data that you're getting might not even be relevant towards your research or hypothesis that you're trying to study. Because you're allowing the person themselves to expand on what they think is important, you might get a lot of irrelevant data. So if I could get you to use those facts to explain why your data from unstructured interview is going to be hard to analyse. Thirdly, it is important that you build a rapport, or someone's not going to open up. They're going to be very closed. They're not going to want to talk about like perhaps more hard-hitting or upsetting or secretive things. So as a sociologist or the person doing the research, you've got the responsibility to make them feel comfortable and open up. And what I'd like you to do is explain why that would require good personal skills and describe that. And finally, and just adding on what we said earlier, a lot of what the people talk about is not relevant to topic. What I'd like you to do is identify why that would make the research more complex. Those of you who are aiming for an A star, go into how that would make it impossible to use this research simply to find out cause and effect. Okay, now unstructured interviews, going on to the ethical issues. There's 4 things that I'd like you to use your information that we previously looked at as structured interviews to expand on each point. So you can gain informed consent, explain why that's important and essential. The participant is in control, explain why that is a positive thing. Feminists are likely to prefer this research method to structured interviews. I explain why from your previous knowledge. And it's normally done in a safe setting. So all I want you to do on those 4 short bullet points, explain why that's important, explain why that's a good thing, explain why it's going to make the research ethical. That is a slightly harder task. If you are struggling with any of it, just drop me an email and I'll help you out with that. Okay, so there we go with that one. Okay, so we've got our practical and our ethical. Now, with regards to evaluation, so although it tends to be quite a nice, safe environment and the participants in control, what we can remember from previous studies is people find it hard to say no face to face to someone. So you might be putting someone, particularly a vulnerable person, in a position where they're talking about sensitive issues that they don't want to talk about, but they feel they have to. So you could talk that as like, although you might do everything you can to try and make the unstructured interview okay, that is an area where you might have some upset. So if I could get you to develop that as your evaluation point. Okay, moving on to our theoretical issues then. So again, I've laid this out into 3 bullet points I want you to develop. The 3 advantages are the participant can ask questions, so explain why that's going to allow you to develop your validity. The researcher is able to build a rapport. You can't do that with a structured interview when it's scripted. You can do it with an unstructured interview where it's more of a conversation. So explain why that's going to get you more valid data. And there are no set questions. The researcher can ask what they want and the participant can talk about what they want. So explain why that's going to get you more background than a closed answered question. So we're now at the stage where we're comparing between 2 different research methods. Okay, now there's 2 things we can talk about disadvantages. Firstly, it is a set up conversation. So this means it is an artificial situation. And remember from before what we talked about, that you may, even though you build rapport, still get that kind of interview bias where people are trying to look good in front of you, simply because it's not a conversation with your friend or a family member. It's a set up artificial environment where someone knows they're in an interview. Secondly, this might be made more extreme if the interview is a power relationship. So maybe if it's like an adult interviewing a child, they're going to want, children are used to having to please adults and see them as an authority figure. So that's going to affect how they do the interview. So you can see the task there. You've got an option of 3 people. It doesn't matter which one you pick, and just explain why that's going to impact how they answer the questions. Okay. And then we've got kind of our nice simple ones to talk about. So for theoretical disadvantage, it's going to take a long time to just interview one individual. You can evaluate that slightly and say that some people will choose to do a focus group where you interview maybe 5 or 6 people at once, but it's still not going to be as representative as other methods. And there's no set script, so the researcher has little control, which means it's going to not be reliable. You can't repeat it in its entirety. Now, in terms of evaluation, what some sociologists have done have found techniques to make their research more valid. So a group of researchers went into school and interviewed teachers, and what they use a range of techniques to get teachers to open up. The most effective one they found was that teachers responded better to questions if the researcher pretended to be dumb, not know what they're doing. It made the teacher feel a bit more comfortable about being honest and opening up. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a lovely weekend after this, or a lovely rest of the day. See you all later. Bye.